This video covers the area of economics, and we're going to cover the subject areas of international trade and foreign exchange. This video contains summary content of some of the content that you may find on the BEC portion of the CPA exam. The video also is going to contain a number of practice questions that will again be approximations of what you may see on the CPA exam. As in all the videos that I have presented, the best way to review this video is to review the information in the summary presentations. As you encounter questions, stop the video, review the question, arrive at your answer, and when you're ready to review the answer, restart the video. Now, before we go on and talk about international trade and foreign exchange, I want to point out the 5 videos here that I'm recommending that you review from Khan Academy. And in this case, a lot of the information that I provide is very summarized. These videos will provide you a great deal more of detailed information about what I am talking about, and will be of great help in terms of understanding the summarized information. So again, you're provided the 5 different videos and the URLs to those videos on YouTube. Now, in a perfect world, trade would be free. Countries would be able to basically import what they needed and export what they produced. However, the real world is not necessarily a perfect world. In some cases, or in many cases, countries institute what they call obstacles to free trade, and that's typically to protect what they consider to be critical industry, or in many cases to protect jobs, unions, producers, things like that. So the first obstacle to trade I want to talk about is what we call as a tariff. And a tariff is nothing more than a tax on imported goods. Let's assume that country A, or let's say the domestic country, had a orange growing industry, and what the country did not want foreign imports of oranges to jeopardize the domestic orange producing producers. So what they could do is they could create a tariff on oranges being imported into the country, and the tariff could be at such a rate that it would make the importation of oranges not necessarily totally prohibitive, but probably make those imports more expensive than the domestic production. The next item is what we call a quota. And again, this would be a formal agreement typically between governments, or it could even be set up unilaterally by a government. And this provides basically a limit on imports. In other words, if we talked about in the previous example of the tariff on oranges, the domestic country that could be importing the oranges may allow a certain quota, and then anything over that quota could either be prohibited, or there could be, again, a tariff placed upon those imports. Another form is what we call voluntary export restraint, and this is usually negotiated between 2 or more countries. And countries basically don't want to get into a situation where they create a tariff against other countries being able to export into that domestic country, because what will happen is those countries that basically the tariff has been created against will go ahead and create some forms of retaliatory tariffs that will impact the potential for the domestic export of their products to those countries. So sometimes nations create voluntary export restraints, embargoes. This is basically, again, implemented by the government of a country, and an embargo is basically prohibited exports or imports from specific countries or even specific parties. Another form of obstacle to free trade is what we call dumping. And dumping is a process of exporting a product from one country to another country and basically selling it below the costs of production. Subsidies, and this is a very popular very popular technique. This is where typically the government provides a subsidy to producers to export goods and or services. And what the subsidy does is it makes those exports less expensive. As an example, a government may provide a tax credit for items that are exported outside of the domestic country to be sold within another country. Now, when there are obstacles to free trade, there are winners and losers. And let's take a look at the obstacle, what happens here. Let's talk first about domestic producers. Now, when let's just say there's some type of obstacle to free trade, let's say there's some type of very high tariff on a particular good that is being produced. Okay, the demand curve shifts to the right as those foreign goods that are being imported, the substitute goods, those foreign goods that are being imported are no longer going to be available, or they're going to be at a cost that consumers aren't going to want them. So the consumers will shift most likely to that domestic product that is being produced. This is a positive impact for domestic producers, as the equilibrium point between supply and demand will be established at higher prices for the product. Domestic consumers, when this happens, the supply curve shifts to the left as the foreign goods, again, are no longer available or more costly, and consumers shift their demand to the domestic product. That means there's a negative impact for the domestic consumers, as equilibrium will be established at higher prices for the product. Foreign producers, in other words, the producer who's actually going to import those goods into the domestic country. In the case of foreign producers, the demand curve shifts to the left as there are fewer buyers for the goods produced, because what's happening is that now those tariffs are making it prohibited, the product that these foreign producers are trying to export into the domestic company, it's going to make them prohibitively expensive. This results in a negative impact to the foreign producers because the equilibrium is going to be established at lower prices for the product. And then the foreign consumers of the country that is going to be exporting, or that is now being prohibited or not being able to export the goods, the supply curve shifts to the right as more goods are available in their own foreign market, since it's not being exported outside of the market. That will result in a positive impact for foreign consumers, as equilibrium will be established at lower prices for the product. Now, in international trade, and again, this is where the Khan Academy has a lot of very good information, and again, I would urge you to take a look at those videos. The balance of trade is basically the difference between the goods exported and the goods imported within a country. If you have a surplus in your balance of trade, that means you have more imports than exports. If you have a deficit in your balance of trade, that means you have more imports than exports. Let's take a look at question number 1. Which of the following indicates a dumping policy? Stop the video, analyze the question, arrive at your answer, then restart the video. Okay, the answer for number 1. Which of the following indicates a dumping policy? Okay, and the answer would be B, selling goods in another country at a price lower than cost. And again, I bring back the definition of dumping, and dumping is the selling of goods in another country at a price below cost. Let's try number 2. Okay, if country A, which is the domestic country, has a trade deficit, there is a net flow of. Again, stop the video, arrive at your answer. When you're ready, restart the video. The answer basically, the answer is if country A, the domestic country, has a trade deficit, there is a net flow of A, goods from the foreign country to the domestic country. We can see the illustration here over on the right-hand side. Here again, country A, the domestic country, it says we have basically a country with the trade deficit, the value of goods and services. If we take a look at the trade deficit, if we take a look at country A, what's happening is it's importing more goods and services from country B than it's exporting itself from country A. So this ends up with a trade deficit. And if you take a look at the left where the red line is drawn through, this would be an example of a trade surplus for country A, where country A is exporting more goods and services to country B than they're importing from country B. Now, the other thing here is that we have to remember when we're talking about trade surpluses or deficit, this is basically goods and services from countries. So it does not include just money from the foreign country. It includes goods and services from the foreign country. So answer B and D would automatically be eliminated because it's just not money, it's goods and services. Now we're going to talk about foreign exchange. Now, this is based upon the fact that every country, and every country for the most part, has their own currency. When you go to England, when you walk into a McDonald's or you walk into just about anywhere and you try to buy something with American dollars, they're not going to accept that because that's not the currency that they use within the country. As a matter of fact, that's a big pain for them because even if they accepted it, they have to go to the trouble of selling that currency in through a bank or a broker and then converting it into British pounds. So pretty much companies, consumers, and so forth want to be paid in their own domestic currency. Now, here's kind of the process, how this works. Let's assume a company in country A buys a product from a company in country B. Now again, remember that country B has its own currency and country A has its own currency. So in this case, to pay the firm in country B, the company in country A will have to find a way to get company's B currency, and that's usually to buy the currency on the open market, either through a broker or through a bank, because company B wants to be paid in their own currency. Now, the rate of exchange that between the two countries' currency is determined by a number of factors, and one of them, major factors, is supply and demand. And again, what happens is that one country's currency is valued in some way and the other country's currency is valued in another way. So what happens is there is an exchange rate that is what we call free market exchange rate, although some of it is controlled by central banks through their reserves. This particular exchange rate is based upon the value of one currency relative to the value of another currency. And when we say exchange rate, we also abbreviate exchange as being F/X for foreign exchange rate. The other thing is that when we're looking at exchanges between different currencies, we have to identify what that currency is. Currencies are often identified by three-letter abbreviations, such as the US dollar is USD, the British pound is GBP, the euro is EUR. Foreign exchange rates between countries change on a very literally on a daily basis for most countries. And again, I would say that the biggest factor regarding the change in an exchange rate between two countries is the supply of that foreign currency of the other country versus the demand for the foreign currency for that other country. So if you happen to be a country A, that the people in country A want the currency because they're going to be spending money in country B, or they want to invest money in country B, they're going to have country B's currency. So you're going to have the demand from the people of country A against what's available as far as currency goes in country B. And of course, if there's a higher demand, the exchange rates are going to change between the two countries' currencies. Other things that impact the country's exchange rates are inflation. Each country will have a different rate of inflation, which will have an impact on the value of their currency. Interest rates, again, each country will have its own interest rates. Its balance of payments, in other words, its surplus. It's surplus for the exchange, basically for goods and services versus deficit for goods and services. I also want to mention there's another institution in most countries called the central bank, which is a bank of the country, and one of their operations is to ensure that the exchange rate between their domestic country and the foreign countries that they deal with is at the rate that the government would like to see or try to maintain it. And the central bank does that by buying and selling their own currency and foreign currencies in the open market. Also, the central bank may have currency reserves, and a currency reserve is cash, in fact, of another country. So if they need additional, if the exchange rate is becoming unfavorable, they may go out and sell those reserves to equalize the exchange rate. Now, we're going to do a real simple example of what I call an FX transaction. And FX, again, stands for foreign exchange, and it can either be F/X or FX. Now, let's assume, and I'm not saying that this has happened, I haven't checked, okay? But let's assume that based upon the supply and demand and any other factors between the US dollar and the British pound, that each British pound is worth $1.60 of US dollars. So if you were to take a British pound to the bank and exchange it, they would give you back $1.60. Now, there's another way of expressing this, and it's basically the inverse of what I just said. And that, what I'm saying is, if every dollar under that exchange rate is worth 62.5 pence, or 62.5 cents or pence, if you want to put it into British, of a British pound, and that's simply taking the British pound divided by the $1.60 for the US dollar, that exchange rate. So now, if you need to settle a debt and have to pay it in 100 pounds, you have to go out and buy those pounds. So in this case, you would have to spend 160 US dollars to purchase 100 British pounds. And I put the calculations below. There's two ways of doing the calculation. First is there's $1.60. That's what the dollar is, how many dollars are in one basically British pound. So if we take $1.60 times 100 pounds, that means 160 US dollars. We can also do it by taking 100, we need 100 pounds, so if we take 100 pounds divided by 0.625, that also equals $160. Now, let's take a look at how exchange rates can impact what goes on between countries. Let's assume right now, I have to go back one slide. Let's assume that if the foreign exchange rate of the US dollar to the British pound, and remember, I'm only talking about one country. We're not talking about euros, or we're not talking about any other pesos or bolivars or so forth. We're not talking about anything between the US dollar and the British pound. So if the exchange rate of the US dollar to the British pound appreciates, okay, so if the exchange rate of the US dollar to the British pound appreciates, and you're probably going to see that word used in the CPA exam, appreciates, it will take less US dollars to buy pounds. For example, if the US dollar was $1.60 to 1 pound, and now the US dollar goes to $1.40 to buy 1 pound, that would be appreciating. Now, people get confused because they say, well, wait a minute, the dollar went from $1.60 to $1.40. And that's true, but that's good, because what it's saying is you used to have to spend $1.60 to buy a pound. Now you have to spend $1.40 to buy a pound. So let's take a look at what happens. Okay, to buy those 100 pounds, it will now take 140 US dollars, which is 100 pounds times $1.40. Remember, it originally would have taken $160. Now, these are the things that are going to happen when the US dollar appreciates relative to the pound. Okay. US exports to the UK become more expensive to the UK. UK imports to the US become less expensive to those holding the US dollars in the US. US tourists in the UK will be able to buy more UK goods and services with the US dollars. UK tourists in the US will be able to buy less US goods and services with their pounds. Now let's take a look at the converse. In this case, we talked about the foreign exchange rate between the US dollar to the pound appreciating. Now we're going to talk about if the foreign exchange rate to the US dollar to the British pound appreciates. So what that means is it's going to take more US dollars to buy a pound. Now, as an example, in this case, this would be a case of depreciation. We started out with that $1.60 to every pound. Now it depreciates, where now it takes, instead of $1.60 to the pound, now it will take 2 US dollars to buy 1 British pound. So if we look at the example in this case, to buy 100 pounds, it will now take 200 US dollars, which was 100 pounds times 2 US dollars, where prior to that, it only took 160 US dollars to buy those same 100 pounds. So we'll take a look at the effect of each of these items here. U.S. exports to the U.K. will become less expensive to the U.K. U.K. imports to the U.S. become, and I should say more expensive to the U.S. U.S. tourists will be able to buy less UK goods and services with US dollars. And UK tourists in the US will be able to buy more US goods and services with their pounds. Now, when we've been talking about exchange rates, I want to give you some definitions because, again, you may run across these exchange rates in the exam. The first one is what we call a floating exchange rate. And that is basically the free market determination of an exchange rate between two countries. And I say based upon the supply of and demand for the currency. Another type of exchange rate, again, for a currency exchange rate, it could be a pegged exchange rate, a rate where the country's central bank will buy and sell a currency on the open market to adjust supply to demand so the country's currency maintains a certain exchange rate, and that's typically within a certain bandwidth of exchange rate. There's another type of exchange rate called a fixed exchange rate, where one country's currency, their exchange rate, is tied to another country's exchange rate. And we have managed exchange rate, a rate where the country's central bank will buy and sell currency on the open market to adjust supply to demand so the country's currency maintains a certain exchange rate. We have another type of exchange rate called the spot rate, and that's the exchange rate of a currency for an immediate exchange right on the spot. That's how you can think of it. A forward rate is the exchange rate for a future exchange transaction. In other words, there's people who are speculating in the currency market and saying that we think it's going to go up, other people think it's going to go down. You can go ahead, buy options to secure those rates. Now, a forward foreign exchange contract allows a buyer to enter into a contract, and it's typically with the bank or broker, to buy or sell currency at a predetermined foreign exchange rate in the future. And in a lot of cases, the people who are buying this just want to, their business is not currency speculation. Their business is selling a product. And once they sell the product, they want to lock in the profit, and they can do that by fixing the FX rate, the foreign exchange rate. FX option, foreign exchange option, upon purchase of the option allows but does not require to buy or sell currency at a specific foreign exchange rate in the future. Okay, now let's try question number 3. Again, stop the video, review the question, arrive at an answer, and when you're ready, restart the video. Okay, in this case, it says a US dollar declines in value relative to the currency values of its trading partners. What statement is true? Okay, if we say declines, that's the same thing. The US dollar depreciates in value relative to the currency values of its trading partners. What statement is true? And in this case, it would be B. U.S. exports are going to tend to increase, and that's because U.S. exports are going to be less expensive. The dollar is able to buy less of a foreign currency. That means that the cost of imports from other countries will be more expensive within the U.S., and exports from the U.S. will be less expensive to other countries. If we take a look at answer A, that's not correct, since in this instance, foreign currencies have appreciated against the dollar. Answer C is not correct because the U.S. balance of payments would improve because the U.S. would increase its exports of goods while imports would fall. Okay, let's take a look at number 4. If the foreign exchange value between a U.S. dollar and the Duchy of Grand Fenwick pound changes from $1 equals 6 pounds to $1 equals 4 pounds. And again, go ahead and, well, before you stop the video, don't try to look up the Duchy of Grand Fenwick does not exist. So I created this country, and its currency is in Fenwickian pounds. So I wanted to get rid of another real country, so we could take a look at this even from a more theoretical standpoint. So go ahead now and stop your video, arrive at your answer, and restart the video. Okay, number 4. If the foreign exchange value between U.S. dollar and the Duchy of Grand Fenwick pound, the GFP, changes from 1 to 6 equals to 1 to 4, that would be B. Grand Fenwick's products imported into the U.S. will become more expensive. That's because it's going to take more dollars to buy Fenwickian pounds. And the Grand Fenwick pound has appreciated against the U.S. dollar. Therefore, the cost of the Grand Fenwick products imported in the U.S. will be more expensive to the U.S., and conversely, exports from the U.S. are going to be less expensive when they're imported into the Duchy. When U.S. tourists exchange their pounds for Grand Fenwick pounds, they're going to find it takes more U.S. dollars to buy those pounds, so the Duchy is more expensive to tourists using U.S. dollars. And the converse is true if you have people from Grand Fenwick visiting the United States. And that's it for our presentation.